Picture this: an unstoppable force, an unforgiving desert, and a storm that hides something far deadlier than sand. Sylvester Stallone takes the lead in a brutal, high-stakes thriller where survival isn't just about muscle. It's about being smarter, faster, and deadlier than the enemy. An ex-Special Forces operative, Stallone, is betrayed by his own government and left for dead in the middle of an uncharted desert. The mission was never supposed to end this way, but now it's personal. The sun is merciless. The sand is endless. But the real danger? It's coming. A sandstorm unlike anything the world has ever seen is approaching. But hidden within it is something worse: a group of highly trained killers sent to finish the job. They know his past. They know his skills. They think they know how this ends. They're wrong, because they forgot one thing: he's still breathing. And when a man like that is left with nothing to lose, there's only one way this ends: with blood, bullets, and a storm of revenge. What happens next? You won't believe it. Stay tuned for all 6 action-packed chapters, each loaded with intense combat, shocking betrayals, and a fight for survival that will push one man beyond his limits. The desert was supposed to be his grave. The sun hung like a molten coin in the sky, the heat rolling off the sand in waves, distorting the horizon. Somewhere, vultures circled. They could wait. The man down below wasn't dead yet. Sylvester Stallone lay face down in the blistering sand, blood crusted along his temple, lips cracked from dehydration. His breathing was shallow but steady. His eyes, when they finally opened, held no confusion, no panic, just awareness. He was alive, and that meant he still had a shot. His arms screamed as he pushed himself up. Sand cascaded off his battered body, revealing torn fabric and raw skin underneath. He turned his head slightly, scanning. Nothing but dunes stretching out for miles. No landmarks, no shelter, no water. They had dropped him here to die. That was their mistake. He dragged himself up to his knees, then forced himself onto his feet, the world swaying around him. His muscles were stiff, his throat raw. But none of that mattered. What mattered was who had done this. He remembered the last thing before blacking out. Men in military gear, their voices clipped and professional. They had drugged him, hauled him onto a plane, and now dumped him here like trash. His mind worked through the options. He had none. Good that he worked best that way. He took a slow breath, gathering his bearings. There was a faint ripple in the air far to the west. Heat waves, shifting unnaturally. Maybe a road. Maybe nothing. Either way, he needed to move. One step, then another. The sand swallowed his boots, each movement dragging at his body like quicksand. But Stallone didn't stop. He never did. Hours passed. The sun scorched his skin, his vision blurred. The world spun around him. But then, something, a shape in the distance, shimmering, almost unreal. A structure? No, vehicles. Half buried, rusted, abandoned. Maybe a convoy that had been swallowed by the desert years ago. He pushed forward, his steps heavy, breath ragged. He reached the first truck and placed a hand against its metal frame. Hot but solid. Reeled that he scanned the area, his mind still sharp despite the exhaustion. Then he saw it. A water canteen, half buried near the second truck. He dropped to his knees, digging it out. The weight was promising. He unscrewed the cap and tipped it. A single drop hit his tongue. Stale but water. He drank slowly and controlled. He needed to make it last. Then movement. A shadow flickered between the wreckage. A whisper of motion just beyond his field of vision. He wasn't alone. Stallone's grip tightened around the canteen as he scanned the dunes. The wind had picked up, stirring the sand into restless eddies. Then he heard it. A low, deliberate click. A rifle being cocked. Stallone didn't freeze. He didn't hesitate. He moved. A dive to the side, rolling behind the nearest truck as the first bullet cracked through the air. Sand sprayed up where he'd been kneeling just seconds before. 2 attackers. Maybe 3. Their movements were controlled and precise. Professionals. But they'd made a fatal error. They thought he was weak. They thought wrong. The fight had just begun. The gunfire was controlled and precise. Not the wild shots of scavengers or amateurs. These were trained killers, professionals. Stallone could tell by the rhythm, the way they moved, no wasted motion, no hesitation. They knew what they were doing. That was fine. So did he. He stayed low, pressing himself against the hot metal of the rusted truck. The sandstorm brewing in the distance had begun to stir up the loose grains around him, turning the air thick. Visibility would start dropping soon. He needed to move before that happened. A sharp whistle cut through the air. A signal. 2 men, maybe 3. Coordinated. They were closing in. Stallone took a slow breath, running his fingers along the rusted side of the truck. His mind worked fast. No weapons. No cover beyond the wreckage. Limited time before the storm hit. That meant he had one chance. Use the terrain, use the chaos. A boot crunched in the sand just beyond the truck's hood. Close. Another set of steps, flanking left. They were moving in a pincer formation. Classic. Effective. Unless he knew how to break it. Stallone grabbed a handful of sand, then snapped his body low and fast around the front of the truck. His movement was sudden and unexpected. The nearest man flinched. Too late. Stallone drove forward, ramming his shoulder into the guy's chest. The impact sent them both crashing into the sand. The attacker grunted, trying to twist his weapon up, but Stallone was already moving. His elbow cracked against the man's wrist, breaking his grip on the rifle. A second later, Stallone's fist smashed into his throat. No sound, no scream, just a choked gurgle as the man's body stiffened, then went limp. One down. Gunfire erupted from the right. The second attacker had adjusted fast, firing from behind another wrecked vehicle. The bullets slammed into the truck frame, kicking up rust and debris. Stallone rolled, grabbing the dead man's rifle as he moved. The second man wasn't hesitating. Good. That meant he'd make a mistake soon. A pause in the gunfire. Stallone moved. He fired twice, not to hit, but to force his enemy to react. The shots hit the sand, sending up a thick cloud of dust. The other man shifted, adjusting position just enough. Stallone was already there. He surged forward, rifle raised, and fired. A single shot. No wasted bullets. The round hit the second man square in the chest, dropping him instantly. Silence. Stallone stayed crouched, scanning. 2 bodies. No movement. No sounds beyond the wind howling through the dunes. His pulse slowed. He ejected the spent magazine and checked the rifle. Half full. Good enough. Then a new sound. A deep, growing rumble. He turned toward the horizon. The sandstorm was almost here. The sky had darkened, the wind picking up speed. The air tasted dry, electric. He had maybe 10 minutes before visibility went to nothing. He searched the bodies quickly. Extra ammo. A knife. A radio. He clicked it on, listening. Static. Then, status report. Target down. A voice. Calm, authoritative, waiting for confirmation. Stallone pressed the transmit button, lowering his tone and keeping it short. No visual. Sandstorm hitting. Repositioning. A pause. Then the voice came back. Copy, stay on him. Stallone clicked off the radio. There were more of them. Of course there were. Whoever had left him here to die had made sure there were hunters waiting to finish the job. The storm would be his cover now. It was dangerous, but so was standing still. He needed to move. He adjusted the rifle strap, grabbed a spare magazine, and set his sights on the darkening horizon. Then he disappeared into the storm. The wind roared like a living thing, whipping sand into Stallone's face as he pushed forward into the storm. The world around him dissolved into a shifting haze of gold and gray. Shapes blurred. Distance became meaningless. The sandstorm was in full force now, a wall of chaos swallowing everything in its path. Visibility was almost nothing, but that worked in his favor. He kept low, moving in short bursts between dunes, staying unpredictable. The rifle was slung across his back, but he kept his grip on the knife. In close quarters, it was faster, quieter, more personal. A voice crackled over the stolen radio again. Team 2, report. What's your position? No response. Then a second voice. Nothing yet. Visibility's 0. We need thermal. They were regrouping, coordinating. That meant they weren't guessing anymore. They had tech, maybe infrared scopes. He needed to level the field. He scanned the storm ahead, eyes narrowing as he spotted a faint outline. A structure, barely visible through the shifting sands. It was low, half buried, maybe an old outpost or an abandoned supply cache. Whatever it was shelter, and it was his next move. He quickened his pace, every step a battle against the wind. The sand wasn't just blinding. It was suffocating, forcing him to wrap a torn scrap of fabric around his face. He reached the building, pressing his body against the sun-baked stone. Old, worn down, but solid. He slipped inside through a narrow opening, the wind howling like a beast behind him. The inside was dark, the air thick with dust and time. A quick scan told him this place had been abandoned for years, maybe decades. Sand covered the floor in uneven drifts, broken crates, shattered glass, and the rusted remains of equipment long forgotten. Then he saw it, an old fuel drum tipped on its side, some liquid still sloshing inside. And next to it, wiring, a trap was forming in his mind before he even finished the thought. He moved fast. He pulled the wiring free, checking the ends. Frayed, but workable. He tore a strip from his sleeve, soaked it in the fuel, then twisted the wiring around it. Improvised ignition, a diversion. He positioned the barrel just inside the entrance, then backed into the shadows, pressing against the far wall. Seconds passed. The storm howled. Then movement. A dark shape slipped through the entrance. The silhouette of a man, cautious but quick. Another right behind him. Stallone stayed still. Let them step inside. Let them believe they were alone. Then he moved. One step, then another, silent despite the sand. The second man was closest. Stallone struck fast, his arm hooking around the man's neck, knife flashing in the dim light. A single, clean cut. No struggle. The body slumped without a sound. The first man turned, reacting but too slowly. Stallone lunged, driving the knife into his ribs, twisting hard. A muffled gasp, then silence. He crouched, dragging the bodies out of sight. Two more down. That left an unknown number still out there, but fewer than before. The radio crackled again. Team 2, respond. He picked it up and pressed the button. Lowered his voice. Storm's too thick. Moving toward the ridge. Copy. Maintain position until visual. Stallone clicked off the radio. No chance he'd be sitting still. He grabbed extra ammo from the fallen men, then turned to his makeshift trap. He lit the fabric with a spark, watching as the flame crept toward the fuel inside the drum. Then he moved, out the back of the structure, into the storm. A minute later, the explosion ripped through the building, sending flames and sand shooting into the air. The wind carried the sound, muffling it, but he knew what would happen next. They'd come running, and when they did, he wouldn't be there. He'd be hunting them instead. The explosion had done its job. The fire burned hot for a moment before the wind swallowed it, dragging smoke and embers into the storm. But the noise, that was what mattered. It would pull them in, forcing them to react. Stallone moved. Fast, he stuck to the shifting dunes, using the wind and sand to cover his tracks. He knew they'd be closing in on the blast site, looking for bodies, trying to confirm if he was dead. That meant he had a window, small but enough. Through the haze, he spotted movement. Shadows flickering against the swirling sand. 3, maybe 4 men. Their posture was tight, weapons raised, scanning every direction. They weren't panicked. They weren't amateurs. But they weren't expecting him to attack. He stayed low, crawling to the crest of a dune, keeping his body tight to the sand. His fingers tightened around the stolen rifle, adjusting his grip. A deep breath. He counted their positions. The nearest one was slightly ahead. The others spread in a loose formation, covering angles but leaving gaps. A shot would give away his position. But up close, that was different. He slid down the dune, silent, moving fast through the wind's cover. The nearest man barely had time to react before Stallone's arm locked around his throat. A sharp twist. A crunch. The body went limp, dragged into the sand. The second man turned just as Stallone lunged, one hand slamming into the barrel of his rifle, jerking it aside as the other drove a knife deep into his gut. A short, brutal movement. No wasted effort. The third man shouted, raising his weapon. Too late. Stallone fired from the hip, a short burst that caught him high in the chest, dropping him instantly. The fourth had distance. He pivoted, calling into his radio, his rifle swinging up. Stallone rolled, grabbing the second man's rifle, pulling the trigger before the other soldier could finish his call. The shot cracked through the storm. The fourth man staggered, then crumpled into the sand. Silence again. The wind screamed through the dunes, carrying the body's heat away into the cold night. Stallone moved quickly, searching them for supplies. More ammo. A canteen, half full, and a pack. He checked inside. Rations, some medical gear, and a map. He crouched, shielding it from the wind, his eyes narrowing. There, coordinates. A marker just a few miles east. A base? A rendezvous? Didn't matter. It was his next destination. The radio crackled. A new voice. Report. No answer. They were waiting. Then another sound. Not from the radio. From a storm itself. A low, growing hum. Mechanical. Distant but closing in. A helicopter. They weren't just searching anymore. They were escalating. Stallone slung the rifle over his shoulder, adjusted the pack, and moved. He had what he needed. The storm wouldn't last forever, and when it cleared, he needed to be somewhere they didn't expect. He pushed forward, disappearing deeper into the desert, toward the coordinates on the map, toward the heart of whoever had started this. The sound of the helicopter cut through the storm, the heavy thrum of rotor blades pushing against the howling wind. Stallone kept moving, his steps steady despite the shifting sand beneath his boots. The storm was thinning now, visibility creeping back, and that meant he was running out of time. He reached a ridge, staying low, scanning ahead. The terrain dipped into a dry basin, half-buried ruins scattered across the hard-packed ground. But that wasn't what caught his attention. Lights. Faint but there. Artificial. The map had been right. A base, or at least a staging point. The helicopter veered, its spotlight slicing through the sand as it swept the area. They were hunting him, searching. He crouched lower, pulling the stolen rifle closer. He had the advantage now. They didn't know he was already here, already watching. Below, a group of figures moved between the ruins. 3, maybe 4. Not random scavengers. Their movements were tight, controlled, trained. He adjusted his position, getting a better view. A truck was parked near the largest structure, its doors open, supplies stacked nearby. A supply run? Or something else? The radio crackled on his belt. Another transmission. Storm's clearing. Sweep the perimeter. No sign of the target. Another voice cut in. He's out there. Stay sharp. They were still guessing. That meant they weren't ready. Stallone exhaled slowly, weighing his options. He could wait and observe. But the moment that storm cleared completely, the helicopter would have full visibility. And if they had thermal imaging, they wouldn't need to search. They'd see him. He made his decision. Dropping to his stomach, he crawled along the ridge, positioning himself for the best angle. He counted them again. 4 on the ground, plus whoever was inside the ruins. And the helicopter. He needed to even the odds. The truck. He slid the rifle strap off his shoulder, steadying it against the sand. His breathing slowed. His finger found a trigger. One shot. That was all he needed. He aimed for the truck's exposed fuel canister. A slow, steady squeeze. The shot cracked through the air, cutting through the last dying gusts of wind. A heartbeat later, the truck went up in a burst of fire and shrapnel. The blast sent 2 of the men flying, their bodies hitting the ground hard. The third staggered, tried to raise his weapon, but Stallone was already moving. He slid down the ridge, rifle in hand, closing the distance before they could regroup. The last standing soldier turned, panic in his movements, shouting into his radio. Stallone fired once. The man dropped. The helicopter banked sharply, its spotlight swinging toward the explosion. A second later, its machine gun roared to life. Stallone hit the ground as bullets ripped through the sand around him. He rolled, keeping low, moving toward the ruins. The door was open, half buried under layers of time and decay. He dove inside, just as the gunfire tore past. Darkness. Dust. The smell of oil and rust. He pressed against the wall, listening. The helicopter circled, sweeping the area. They wouldn't risk landing, not without clearing the place first. Footsteps. Someone else was inside. Stallone's grip tightened on the rifle. He stayed still, waited. The footsteps were careful, deliberate. Whoever it was, they weren't panicked. Then a voice. Low, calm. You took your time. Not an enemy. Not a soldier. Someone who had been expecting him. Stallone didn't lower his rifle. The voice came from the shadows, steady, controlled. Someone who wasn't afraid. Someone who had been waiting. He took a step forward, his eyes adjusting to the darkness inside the ruins. The walls were cracked, pieces of stone and metal half buried under layers of sand. In the faint light, he saw him. A man stood near an old console, dusted over from years of abandonment. He was older, lean, and dressed in desert-worn tactical gear. His expression was unreadable, but there was no mistaking the recognition in his eyes. You survived, the man said. I figured you would. Stallone didn't answer. Not yet. His mind worked through the pieces. The ambush, the radio transmissions, the way this man stood, as if none of it was a surprise. You know me, Stallone said finally. His voice was rough, dry from the desert air. The man nodded. I know what they did to you. He gestured toward the wreckage outside. And I know why they want you dead. Stallone stepped closer, the rifle still in his hands. Who are you? The man exhaled, as if considering how much to say. Then, someone who used to be on the inside. Just like you. The weight of the words settled. Stallone didn't move. They sent you out here to disappear, the man continued. Made sure no records led back. No trails. You were never supposed to come back. He gestured toward the radio clipped to Stallone's belt. But you didn't stay dead. And now they know that. Stallone's jaw tightened. He had already figured that much. What he didn't know was why. The man seemed to read his thoughts. You weren't just a loose end. You were a threat. Something you knew. Something you weren't supposed to remember. And if you don't remember it yet, you will. Outside, the helicopter's searchlight swept over the dunes. The radio on Stallone's belt crackled again, voices moving, orders shifting. They're getting ready to sweep the ruins, the man said. We don't have long. Stallone studied him. Every instinct told him this wasn't a coincidence. This man wasn't just a survivor. He was part of something bigger. You got a name? Stallone asked. The man gave a small, knowing smile. Not one that matters anymore. Stallone glanced toward the doorway. Time was running out. The helicopter was still circling, but the ground forces would be closing in soon. He had started this alone, but now the rules had changed. He looked back at the man. If you know so much, tell me one thing. The man waited. Stallone's grip tightened around the rifle. What happens next? The man's smile faded. We finish it. Stallone took a breath. He had spent his whole life fighting battles that weren't his. Following orders. Taking out targets without asking questions. Not this time. This time it was personal. Outside, the first boots hit the sand. Inside, Stallone shifted his stance, the weight of the rifle solid in his hands. They were coming, and he was ready,